So I wanted to get started asking about what the experience was like of really getting the movie together, and what it really inspired you to make the documentary and getting everything started overall in the project.
Yeah, I mean, getting started was exciting because it didn't really feel real until Eddy signed on. So it was really a process of like trying to get Eddy interested. And we actually had done a short documentary segment for a kind of a documentary TV show we worked on. And we interviewed his daughter. And then it was like, wow, we need to do this as a full feature and we need to get Eddy. And I was kind of surprised he was still alive. I mean, because he's 90 now. And so back then he was like mid 80s when we first started kind of talking to him. And so when he signed on, it was like, oh, wow, this is exciting documentary. And then kind of the next big thing was like, oh, well, what is this documentary about in the present day, right? You know, because documentaries, in my perspective, I wanted something happening present day, and then also talking about like the wild historical aspects of the film, like the hostage taking and, you know, a bunch of other wild things. And he was like, well, I still want my island back. And I was like, what? And so I was like, wow, awesome. So that was kind of getting him interested and understanding that he still wanted to do something in his life with the island was exciting. And then I was like, okay, let's start producing the documentary. Let's start researching. Let's start kind of the heavy lifting.
And speaking of the research and really looking into the history of Eddy and the island and his relationship with what was going on in the community and the island overall, what was that experience like for you to really delve into his past and just the history surrounding the situation as well?
Well, it was so interesting because I expected, so like kind of the big kind of pinnacle moment in his life was the hostage taking. In the news, let's say. And that was mid 70s. And so I wasn't around for that. And so I expected like, you know, every single news organization all over the world to have covered this hostage taking and But there actually wasn't a lot. I mean, I think it was network news, but there just weren't a lot of tapes. There was some newspaper articles, but nothing, it was more always the same newspaper article. So it was actually a challenge to really dig down and kind of see how people reacted back then, you know, see what people were saying and so that was actually more challenging than I thought it would be to deal with the hostage taking. But it was really fun to like, you know, we actually found some hostages. So talk to like the chargé d'affaires who was like in charge of the embassy in Lebanon and talk to him. And then also talk to another a gentleman who was a hostage. And it was wild things came up like this man who was a hostage, actually 5 years after the hostage taking was a hostage taker himself. And so it was like, what? And we couldn't get that in. We interviewed him, we asked him about this, but we couldn't get his hostage taking in there because it would just make no sense. But, you know, it was just so fun to really dig down and talk and get these wormholes of information from people and learn where, you know, all these wild things. And, you know, like many documentaries, you know, you can only get about a third of the, you know, if that, of kind of like wild ideas in there. And this certainly, like even some of Eddy's stuff that he told me that he has never told anyone else, he told me on camera, but it just didn't make sense for the documentary. But, you know, it was every day talking to him in front of camera was just unearthing something wild. And so I really tried to bring that to the film and reveal all these wild things. So it's not like you get one wild thing and then we're understanding it in the documentary. It's like every 5 or 10 minutes, I want to tell the audience another wild thing.
Mm-hmm. And well, I also wanted to ask about your overall experience directing the documentary as well. And once you did the research, just your general approach to figuring out how you wanted to put the story together and just really directing the overall film as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Directing is I love certain aspects of it, and other aspects I actually find quite challenging. So what I love is the story crafting, is spending time with the people, kind of drawing their stories out. And so, you know, like I kind of mentioned before, like talking to Eddy and understanding he wanted to get the island back, and understanding that, oh yeah, I could weave this narrative in with the historical narrative. And so that was really exciting. And then so thinking about from a directing mindset, okay, what things can I get Eddy to do, or where can he go to kind of show that he wants this island back? So obviously the island, and then obviously talk to, like, you know, the premier of our province, you know, which is like the governor basically. And so that was like really exciting from a directorial standpoint. The challenging bits for me are like, I really love the verite, kind of the run and gun vibe. And trying to make that happen has always been trying to feel like I'm adequately getting this person in their real life, not staged. When documentaries do that and they do it well, I love it. And so for me, that's the stress of always trying to like get in the background, but make things happen, but get the, get like kind of this real vibe. Because I think the great thing about documentary, or one of the great things is we see someone's life without the trappings of them presenting, whether it's like on social media and everyone's kind of, using their phones in their way, or knowing they're on camera. So I think that was a really challenge, and I still struggle with that. And I still, in the documentary, when I see it, I'm like, oh, this scene, if I could have done this or that. But I think it's, for me as a director, it's a lifelong learning process, and figuring out how to kind of get that verite is gonna evolve, and that's kind of also the fun challenge of documentary filmmaking.
And also, like you mentioned earlier, getting to speak with some of the hostages as well. And I also just wanted to ask a little bit more about that experience of figuring out who you wanted to interview and really include in the documentary, and that experience of interviewing them and really figuring out what you wanted to ask them and discuss with them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think when I wanted, talking to the hostages, I really wanted to get a sense of what they felt and how they experienced it, because that was one of the things that Eddy just couldn't relate, because he didn't understand what putting a gun in someone's face did to them, and I couldn't either. Like, I've never had a gun in my face, but I think he thought it was like, well, because the government stole my island from me, these people are okay with me holding them hostage because they know I'm in the right. That's what he thought. That is not what they thought. And so I really wanted to be like, okay, well, like, how did, you hear about people having, like PTSD for years after this fact, and all that sort of stuff. So I think it was like really important to kind of hear that perspective. And I would take that one kind of level higher, that Eddy's has a very interesting perspective, and he's got a very compelling story, and he's in the right in certain instances of his life, but he's also very much in the wrong, from my perspective, in certain instances. And so I really wanted to hear from those other people who could say, like, yeah, like, Eddy did something pretty horrendous and he wasn't right to do that. And so, that perspective also came from his family. Like, his kids are like pretty frustrated with him in a lot of times, and like, he kind of chose this rocky island over them. And so I think hearing from them, and also hearing from his first wife, his ex-wife, I really wanted to get her on camera, and she just wasn't willing to go there. And because she just had some trauma, like Eddy's, it was a domestic abuser. And so I certainly didn't want to force her to talk, or, play hardball to get her to talk, because that's like, she's a victim. However, I wanted to give her perspective justice. And so that was the challenge of like, okay, how do we do that? And we kind of settled on like, well, if her daughter, who we interviewed, Michelle, we interviewed her daughter on camera. And then, so she helped us just get a few quotes that from Eddy's ex-wife, that kind of just like countered what he was saying. And so that was like the challenge of just kind of like tempering Eddy's story, which is great and interesting, just with a bit of a reality check, and then allowing the audience to kind of figure out, well, who do I side with, but just maybe give a better version of Eddy, or more realistic version of Eddy.
And also, like you mentioned earlier, about there not being as much footage like on the news, like you might have thought. Was that something that, when you were looking for clips and photos as well, from Eddy's past, did that influence the way that how much you can include in the film, and like what was that experience like of really figuring out what kind of footage you can also include besides the interviews as well?
Yeah, that was a massive challenge, because again, I was like, okay, well, we'll have all this hostage footage, and I mean, there was a little bit of hostage footage from like the AP, Associated Press, and another broadcaster, but it was kind of there wasn't a lot, and it was quite expensive for our budget. Like, we didn't have a very big budget, and so what we decided on was like, well, let's do some recreations but just from a photographic sense, and kind of parallax it and kind of trying to animate this, or like, maybe not animate, but just kind of bring it alive a bit more, this hostage scenario with these photos and some sound design. And so, you know, with our budget, we had a budget for basically like 2 shoot days, like outside of the actual filming. And so it was hired actors, get some like costumes, and then just take some photos of all these different scenes, and then use those as kind of our B-roll. And so, you know, overall, considering the budget we had and considering the, you know, the time we had, I'm really happy with how they turned out. One of my concerns was like, well, you know, it's not real, you know, so we're kind of like pretending that we're putting all this, you know, footage, photos, but I think people can see that it's not actual footage from back then. And so, you know, a lot of documentaries, I mean, not a lot, but many documentaries do that. And so I felt, you know, once I got over that initial, like it actually really works for me, and it just keeps the visual interest and also just helps set the mood. But yeah, they're like, I was kind of shocked that there just wasn't a lot of footage. You know, it's like Wild Wild Country, you know, like they just went to this library and got so much raw footage of all these things that happened. And I kind of expected it to be like that. And there was like nothing. So it was a fun creative challenge looking back on it.
And I also wanted to ask about working with your cinematographer, especially with the interview footage and recreating those past events and really figuring out how you wanted to shoot the film and really present the events visually as well.
Yeah, that, you know, the cinematographer that I worked with on this one, you know, we've worked on a ton of things before. And so what I like about him is he really likes this kind of like super like fly on the wall mentality of like, let's not try and set up too much. Let's just try and like get what we get. And if it's a little low light, then that's okay. And like I've worked with other cinematographers where there's a lot of like, okay, no, let's stop here. We need to relight. And it's just like, well, the vibe of what's happening now, we're losing it because we have to like wait to change a lens or do this or that. And so that's, I think for me, that was kind of a learning process. And so working with Greg, who's the cinematographer, was awesome because he was that first. He was like, let's get the reality of what's going on. The other big decision we made was, okay, well, for Eddy, we're gonna have him look down the lens when he's being interviewed. And then have everyone else kind of look off camera like the traditional interview style. And I'm really happy we did that because I think, you know, it shows that Eddy is trying to kind of plead his case. That was kind of the visual idea, that Eddy's trying to plead his case to the viewer, and then everyone else is kind of like the corroborating or not, or like disagreeing with what he's saying. And so visually, you know, I'm quite happy with that. And, you know, there was a challenge of, well, because we didn't have a ton of budget, it was like, okay, let's do 3 days in the studio and we'll just get all the interviews done there. You know, it was like, okay, what can we do? Because we don't have time to, like Wild Wild Country, go to these people's houses and set up this beautiful interview. You know, we don't have that time as much as I wanted to do it. So we basically were like, okay, well, everyone's got the same background. And then we had to fly to a few different cities to get other interviews. So we basically just travel with that background. And so that was important, just to keep that kind of the flow, the visual flow consistent.
And also I wanted to ask about editing the final version of the movie together and really figuring out how you wanted to present the story in the final version of the film as well.
Yeah, editing was pretty straightforward. I mean, I had a really clear understanding of the visual I wanted and the narrative I was really hoping for. I think the trick was like really trimming it down. Like this could be like a 4 hour, you know, like a 4 times 1 hour mini series. But it was that we just didn't have the budget to really do justice to that. So I was like, okay, which is maybe a good thing. Like, how do we trim it down to 85 minutes? And like, what are really the important things? And what is the, like one thing that kind of came out near the end of the editing was this kind of like relationship between Eddy and Fadwa, his daughter, and kind of like trying to pull that family aspect, because I think that kind of humanizes him, but then also shows that what he's lost, you know, like his daughter is still trying to connect with him. His other kids aren't, but his daughter is trying to connect with him. And so that was kind of like one of the narratives that kind of came up, not during the edit, but maybe as we were filming or near the end of filming, where I was like, well, you know, this is I think going to touch some people and just kind of show that I guess it highlights obsession and kind of the downside of obsession, because you can't connect with anyone else in your family. All you're obsessed with is this island. So yeah, that was the fun, the narrative, and then all the VFX that took a lot of time, but I think it was just kind of like, in the end, it was just dropping everything in. Yeah, so it was very gratifying to have it done.
And then lastly, I wanted to ask about the film's upcoming release and what that process was like of figuring out how you wanted to distribute the movie overall as well.
Yeah, that was a challenge, because this is like our kind of second feature doc, and the first one we didn't decide to distribute it out like in a large way. So it's a bit of a new world, and we're based in Canada, and so I really wanted to get a distributor on board in the States who just is known and can kind of help us in that world, and so talking to Gravitas was really exciting and really great. And then the fact that, like, okay, in January 26th, we're getting it all released on VOD, on Amazon, iTunes, all this sort of stuff is like, okay, like that's something that me personally, like, I don't have experience doing. And so it's really cool to be like, to partner with someone like that and feel that they're kind of on your side to kind of make it happen. Because, anytime anyone sees this documentary, like, I'm really excited. I love talking about it, and love the fact that people, whenever they see it, seem to want to talk about it. And so the more people it gets in front of, it's just more exciting for me, and Gravitas has really helped in making that happen. And film fests were great too.
Okay, great. Thank you very much again for taking the time out. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ken. I love talking about this. And your questions were really great and on point. So
great. Thank you again.